Hello and welcome to day 16 of our daily Bible readings. Today we're going to be looking at Genesis chapter 39 to 41 and Luke chapter 16. So Joseph has ended up in Egypt after his brothers got rid of him, and he is in a home. He's a slave in a home of a master, and the master sees God in Joseph and treated him well. I think this is something interesting for us to think about. How do people see God in us? Now, I don't want people to see God in us so that we can manipulate them and end up with a bunch of blessings. Joseph wasn't being obedient to God just so that he would be treated well. Joseph was being obedient to God because he was faithful, because he saw God with his heart. And he was blessed along the way. He didn't do it in order to gain wealth, but he did end up becoming wealthy. When we do God's work and God is seen in us, we are building up God's kingdom in the here and now, today, right here. And this is what makes the world better. And sometimes along the way, we are blessed. But I think it is a challenge to us to think about, how will God be seen in me in all of the choices I make today? Joseph also is very careful to regularly give God credit for many things in his life, particularly his ability to interpret dreams. When you look at the names he chose to give his children, his two sons, they are both names that credit God with helping Joseph in his life. And so this is another way that Joseph is showing the world that he is faithful to God. The main dream that Joseph interprets for the Pharaoh involves this time of famine. The 7 strong cows, the 7 weak cows, the grains of wheat and everything. And this makes me think, do we intentionally prepare for bad times ourselves these days? A lot of us are working on preparing for retirement, and we work with financial planners and we're setting aside for retirement. But it used to be that humans were regularly preparing for bad times. They assumed that every year or two they would have a famine and they would lose their crop. And when they talked about abundance, it wasn't having all the money they could imagine in the world. Abundance was having enough to live on, enough food, enough water for 2 or 3 years at a time. They weren't looking at forever. They weren't looking at wealth the way we think of wealth. They just wanted enough food to be alive for the next 2 to 3 years. And so I think this is something for us to think about. Here, Joseph organized the Egyptians for 7 years to prepare for a terrible famine, and they ended up having enough resources that they could help many nations. People from all over came to Egypt and were helped. How many of us are living paycheck to paycheck? How many of us are buying houses we can barely afford, cars that are really more expensive than we really need? Tons of stuff. How many of us are spending thousands of dollars on all sorts of lessons and experiences for our kids? Are we ready for a time of famine? Are we ready to get through bad times? Or are we just barely getting by right now? I think this is a very challenging thing for us to think about right now. Looking at Luke chapter 16, there's a story about master and servants, and how people use the resources that they've been given in this world by God. And one of the interesting lines in there, if the Creator can't trust you with resources of this world, then how will you be trusted in heaven? Jesus points out that there are some really clever people in the world, and there's a bad servant in this story that is very clever and kind of figures out how to play a game to protect himself. It's not very good for his master, but he takes care of himself. And Jesus recognizes the wisdom and the cleverness in this scheme. And Jesus is kind of like, you know what? If you can't be clever with what God's given you here, what about when you get to heaven? So I don't think Jesus wants us to be corrupt in this world. I think Jesus wants us to be honest. But I still think Jesus appreciates cleverness and the times that we are able to figure out ways to stretch our resources and be able to do more with less. So once again, we're kind of thinking about possessions here, a little bit like what we think about with Joseph's stories. And are we really holding on to our possessions? Are we trying to find security in our possessions, or are we turning to God for our security? We have a wonderful story about a rich man who ends up going to hell. He has not been generous to the poor man who's been asking for help. From his place in hell, the rich man sees the poor man in heaven. And the rich man gets God's attention and say, hey, can you send him back? I screwed up, but my relatives are still screwing up. Can you send him back so that he can warn them? And God's like, you know what? I gave you a chance. I sent Moses. I sent the prophets. You've got the Holy Scriptures to read. And I sent this poor guy, and you couldn't figure it out. Your relatives aren't going to figure it out either. You need to listen to the prophets, listen to Jesus' teachings, and follow them. This is another challenging thing. Who are we listening to? How many of us take the time to read the prophets? How many of us go back to the Hebrew Bible and see the lessons that God has been placing before us for generations, for centuries, for millennia? And how often are we choosing not to pay attention? Oh, that tithing thing, that doesn't really apply to us. Oh, that love your neighbor thing, that doesn't really apply to us. Oh, the gleaning thing, making sure that we give some of everything we have, that doesn't apply to us. Well, from this story, Jesus is saying, yeah, it still applies. I meant it when I sent those prophets with those messages. So go back, read it, listen, hear, and put those teachings into action. Hope you have a super day. We'll see you next time.